reviewing, like remember from chapter 1, big things. There are some definitions we had to know, right? Anatomy, physiology, that one's kind of a given. Anatomy was like looking at the structure of the body, like how it looks, where it is. Physiology was how that thing functions, right? So we kind of talked through that's the definition. So as we get into other systems, right? When we talk about unit 2, when we talk about bones, well, one, we got to look at the anatomy of bone. How do we know what it looks like? Where are bones? Names of bones. But then the other thing is like, why do we have bones? What's their function? What's their AKA physiology? We talked about the 11 body systems in chapter 1. You don't have to know all of them. Big highlights from that or some of the unique things that our integumentary system we talked about in chapter 6, right? It's our skin, but it's also hair, nails, and glands, usually sweat glands. Key functions on the skin were protection, temperature regulation, water retention, and sensation. We kind of talked on that. That's a big highlight for me, those two systems, as far as because they carry on. And then the skeletal system carries on into Unit 2, but that was another highlight from the 11 systems. The unique thing about the skeletal system to remember, too, as we get into Unit 2 and for this test, really, is that if I ask you something about the skeletal system, I'm probably going to throw something about bone marrow in there. Bone marrow is really important, especially as an adult, for blood cell production, basically. Without bone marrow, we don't make blood cells. So, but other stuff with the skeletal system makes sense. Movement, protection, that stuff makes sense. Most of us can think of that. But the bone marrow part and blood cell production, people don't put those two and two together. So there's always potential with if you had bad bone health to lead to other things. Your other things from unit 1 stuff from chapter 1, especially like directional terms, right? Proximal, distal, lateral, medial, um, anterior towards the front. I can't see my hand. Anterior towards the front, posterior or dorsal towards the back. Anterior was also known as ventral, but and then you kind of remember. Like I'm just running through these, not expecting that you're going to write all this down, but that you've already had this and just kind of touching on right up and down too, superior, inferior, and then your planes, right, mid sagittal or sagittal, cutting the body in a left and right portion, transverse, and then the frontal plane, kind of cutting us down in the front half so we can kind of see. Other stuff that was kind of covered in that first chapter was the body cavities. If you remember, we've got thoracic cavity, we've got abdominal cavity, or abdominal pelvic kind of includes both of those areas. And then there's that weird one that I highlighted too. That's what is the heart is encased in. So the chest cavity itself is a thoracic cavity. But if you inside that thoracic cavity, we have right under the sternum, mediastinum in the middle. Mediastinum is the name for the cavity that the heart's in, right in the middle. That's another one that kind of people forget. And then for chapter 3 is a bulk of this test too, which you guys did the quiz on. So the quiz was a pretty good review on just organelles. Doesn't mean you're going to have maybe you're not going to probably see 10 questions on organelles on this test, but you definitely will see something about organelles. So remembering the basics. Nucleus is your control center, has your genetic information, DNA and RNA. Uh, Proteins get passed from there, or the information for proteins goes over to our ER. And remember the ribosomes, right? The ribosomes are the ones that actually make the proteins. The ER is just a place that holds the ribosomes in place, holds them still, and helps move information around. Golgi apparatus is your transporting center to take those proteins and package them up and get them ready to go. And when they leave the Golgi, they're going in some kind of vesicle outside the cell, inside the cell. Excuse me. But if those proteins don't get used, right, remember that lysosomes come around and can clean them up. Tamia, do you have a question?
Yes, I don't mean to backtrack. I'm sorry, but
That's okay.
with RNA, can you just give like a quick example for me? I know you just did, but like I just can't understand it for some reason. I know DNA, and so what's RNA supposed to do with
Really, what
DNA?
what RNA is that if you kind of imagine it in a simpler way, like DNA, right, is what makes us us. We have a genetic structure. Basically, a bunch of DNA is basically a combination of chemicals bound in a way that makes us who we are. RNA is just another branch of DNA, basically. RNA is rooted more protein based, which proteins at their molecular level is we're talking about. Well, I'm not even getting that. That's all on rabbit trail. Basically, RNA hangs out in there is a partner with DNA. So whenever our cells want to make protein, RNA is basically like the coding that runs alongside DNA. They join, and then that sends that RNA out to go make proteins. It's like a manuscript or like a list of code. I don't know if you know anything about like computers and stuff. Like this computer program we're using right now, Teams, has like a background of coding, if that makes sense. Like it has a basics that you have to put in to make it work. Otherwise, it would never work. If in coding and like IT, era coding, like it's usually numbers and letters and symbols and words, and that's kind of what protein and DNA or RNA and DNA are for us. DNA is about the coding that makes us who we are and our genetic makeup. The RNA is an assistant that's coding about how do we make proteins, and we need proteins for everything in life. So it's just another. It's why I say genetic information is why I include RNA in that. RNA just doesn't really make us like skin color, eye color. It doesn't really make us who we are. RNA is really just all about protein manufacturing, is what it's
Okay.
about. That's all you
Okay.
really need to know. So if you hear RNA, you're thinking protein and ribosomes that start with an R. That's all it is. The book goes in more detail, and I could get into more detail, but I think that it's, again, like I glossed over it too for us in lecture originally, because I just think there's so much detail there that it's not relative to you as a nurse as much, unless you go down a path of studying those kind of things. You get into genetics, or you get into things like that, and you get your RN and do stuff like that, it will come up again. But I can tell you that from my personal experience, even though I've had a very regiment A&P class that was all I learned all that again, doesn't mean if I was going to go do genetics and do that kind of nursing, I would have to reteach it all to myself. So I think it's irrelevant for me to try to squeeze that into your brain capacity at this point, at this stage, just for you to have to really work hard to refresh yourself again, if that's something you ever look at. Otherwise, you could go through nursing and never talk about RNA again, and it would never phase you, if that makes sense. So that's why I don't want to spend too much time on it. But I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yes,
So
it
you're
did.
okay. Yeah. And so yeah, your organelles, your transport, active versus passive. Just remember that anything active, it requires ATP, that energy molecule that our cells generate. Passive means that it just happens naturally. Passive usually is something trying to balance out the force, so to speak, if you're a Star Wars fan, like balance and equal out either molecules, or in osmosis case, water moves to kind of equal itself out, right? That's what it's talking about with transport. And then you just have the transport methods within that wheelhouse of either active or passive. Passive being osmosis, diffusion, active being your pumps, your protein pumps, like sodium potassium pump is an example, or your cytosis is the Pinot, remember pina colada, cell drinking, Fago, cell eating, those kind of things. And then from chapter 3 to make sure you know the difference between mitosis and meiosis. Those were our types of cell division. Mitosis being the normal, our cell divides, makes two exact copies of itself, so that's how our cells multiply and stay. And meiosis was only done by sex cells, like for females, eggs, male sperm, because it doesn't copy our whole genetic information. It basically takes half of it, 23 chromosomes, so that it can meet up with the opposite sex and make a person. So just know the names, definitions, mitosis, meiosis. Another thing, so tissue wise, again, this is not all encompassing, but I figured I'd take a few minutes and try to give you guys a run through of like the big stuff you want to be focused on if you haven't looked at it. Tissue wise, I think the biggest thing from tissues is that, yep, there's 4 types of tissues. That's chapter 5's information. Epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, which is kind of its whole big thing, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Now, nervous tissue, I just mentioned that it's neurons, it's what makes our electrical signals happen. And that's all I'll mention for nervous tissue, because we have a whole chapter on nervous tissue, neurons, the brain. That's chapter 11, and it is the longest chapter in the book. I think chapter 11 is almost 50 pages. It's huge. It's huge information. So we're not going to spend too much time on that. The thing to remember about epithelial tissue is the 2 places I think about epithelial tissue is like skin, obviously. And then I think about and in the skin, I mentioned two types of epithelial tissue, like as far as their categories, the simple or the stratified. Stratified epithelial is usually talking about somewhere that needs thick layers, stacks on stacks of epithelial tissue. That's like your skin, your mucous membranes, and your mouth. Things that touch a lot of stuff. Like your mouth touches a lot of things, especially, like I said, babies. That's how they learn the world around them. Our mouth is the same way. We eat food, it scratches all that up, epithelial tissue, and we need layers. But on the other end of the spectrum, I think of epithelial tissue in like the thinnest places. The examples are in your blood vessels, because you want your blood vessels to be really thin so that molecules can cross the boundary easy. They're like single cell layer of epithelium. Same thing with the smallest part of our lungs where the gas exchange happens, where oxygen, CO2 go back and forth. That's epithelial. And then the connective tissue, you guys remember, it's a big kind of thing to think about. But with connective tissue, just think the definition for connective tissue was kind of the most varied, meaning the most different types. That's what varied is saying. Most varied and abundant, meaning the most like you can find connective tissue everywhere. Remember? So most varied or most abundant and varied type of tissue we have is connective tissue because it has such a wide range of different little subtypes. So keep up with your connective tissue. You'd be able to name dense connective tissue is mainly just your tendons and ligaments. That's found in pretty much every joint we have in our body. And then loose had those kind of three subtypes underneath loose connective tissue. If you remember, adipose, like our fat tissue, uh, reticular tissue or reticular, which is like mainly in the lymph node, spleen, I think, and in bone, technically, more fibrous and connective. And then the other one was let's see, what did I say? So adipose, fat tissue, reticular, and
Areolar.
areolar. There you go. Thank you. Areolar is the one that is found pretty common places, like right under our skin, along with adipose. Areolar and adipose are pretty much in a lot of places because areolar is like more of a cushion, kind of foamy, almost like a gel, like connective tissue, and that's we find under our skin and everywhere. So kind of just have again with all those, it sounds like so much information, and it is. You need to you cannot memorize paragraphs and think that you're going to retain any of it. You've got to shorten this stuff down and think of one words to write down to help you kind of locate. So a lot of times with that sort of stuff, I'll just write what the tissue type is. Like dense and connective, you can just write tendons and ligaments, joints, connects muscle to bone and bone to bone. That's all you'd have to write. Loose, you would write all three of those guys down and write kind of a word or two to help you remember what the difference is between those three loose connective tissues, and then go and write where you might find them, that sort of stuff. That's the kind of stuff you want to start learning how to study and break down, not the whole like paragraph about it, if that makes sense. And then the other a big thing with, again, I said nervous system, but the cardiac tissue is, we talk about skeletal cardiac, or not, that's not cardiac. I said cardiac tissue. I meant muscular tissue. We talk about skeletal muscle tissue a lot in chapter 10, so we'll get there soon. But as far as the tissues chapter in chapter 5, muscle has three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. I would just know the main difference between those three is that the only one that we have control over, voluntary control, like our brain tells it what to do, is the skeletal one. The other two we don't control. They just happen by electrical impulses, hormones, other things control them. And I would just note where to find them. Obviously, skeletal makes sense. I find that attached to skeleton, like bones, okay, my skeleton. Cardiac is the name for the heart. I only find cardiac muscle in the heart. Smooth muscle I can find kind of everywhere for the most part. Blood vessels, lungs, all over the GI tract. But again, writing one word to make it, you want to find ways to differentiate, meaning find the difference between things. That's how I study. And then the big thing from chapter 6 was just layers of the skin. You remember, we can also call the skin a cutaneous membrane, or it's called the cutaneous membrane. And that is really just the epidermis, which is basically our stack of cells with no blood vessels, and then the dermis, which is the layer underneath that is still part of skin. Skin has two layers, epidermis and dermis, and the dermis was that layer that had our our nerves, blood vessels, sweat glands in it, all the big stuff. And then underneath that was known as the hypodermis, or you could call that subcutaneous because it's below the cutaneous layer. And that was like our layer of adipose and areolar connective tissue. Like that's the sub layer. So it's not technically part of the skin, but those are tough because they have synonyms. They have names that mean the same. You can call the skin cutaneous membrane. You can call the layer underneath that the hypodermis, or you can call it subcutaneous. Subcutaneous is more general, right? It's just saying this is below the skin, but they call that layer the hypodermis. And then the other big thing from skin was skin changes that I highlighted that are more medical related, right? Cyanosis, those kind of things. And then the other big thing from skin was burns. You got to have the burns down. You're definitely going to see some questions on burns, right? So just knowing the difference between first, second, and third degree burn. And so we will spend about the first 45 minutes of class tomorrow just doing that, like a review game to kind of goof around and fresh up on that because your peers in the afternoon got to do that yesterday. And then we'll take the exam. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. And then after the exam, we'll go finish the lecture that we're going to start tonight. So that's kind of basically trying to think. That was a really quick 20-minute kind of just summary, but those are like the high points of that chapter or of that unit, excuse me, of unit 1, all 4 of those chapters. Somebody have a
Question,
question?
sir.
Yes.
Good evening again, everyone. Will there be any diagrams that we'll have to do or anything like that?
No, you will not. It's a good question, Elaine. No, you won't have to do any labeling or anything like that. I mean, possibly in the future for disclosure, I'd love to do stuff like that. D2L might be a little bit limited, but I will say that they introduced last year officially the NCLEX, people that write the examination started introducing some what they call next generation questions, which have some matching and some other things. The good news is that we're getting, for a while there, for about 6 months, that test had started being implemented, but companies like Kaplan and other review companies for the NCLEX didn't have resources to us yet to kind of make those questions. So the good news is that we do have those resources now, and you will start getting introduced to those kind of quote unquote next gen questions in first trimester. So I don't doing them right now because I think my goal for you guys is let's just get the kind of traditional question format down. Let's just get true, false, or multiple choice down, and then start introducing some newer, more nursing specific type stuff. But for me, I don't do any labeling. We do labeling practice in class or images and looking at it in class because I think it's helpful to it's a kinesthetic, different kind of learning, and it helps some people. So, but as far as your exam, I stick to multiple choice or true, false. And like I said, by I think exam 4 or 5, I have to look. I start throwing in at least one and pretty much only one select all apply, which is the nursing very specific format of giving you multiple answer choices that are correct. So you'd have to pick 2 or 3 that would be correct. But you got a few tests before we get into that sort of stuff, and we'll practice those in class with WooClap anyway. But thank you for the question, Lance. Good question. So yeah, it should be fairly bog standard. Remember, your tests are 50 questions, and the biggest thing I say about exams is that it's just all exams are not. It's a formative way. It's a formative assessment, basically. It's trying to see if, and that's the same thing with the final. The final is like a check because a lot of people can do well on every test and still do bad in the final because the final is comprehensive, meaning it covers everything. That means that you didn't retain it. So my goal here is to start getting you away from learning how to just memorize stuff and then answer a question to like retaining it and having an ability to understand it and comprehend it and use it later. Because if you just memorize and get through this class, you might be smart enough and have the capacity to pass this class, but then do poorly in the program. And that's any nursing program because we have to start teaching you how to like think critically and utilize information you've already heard so you can build upon it. And it takes time. It does not happen overnight. It won't happen by the end of this class. That's why I'm very introductory. But again, the biggest thing for exams, don't overthink. you can only work with information you have. I have a lot of people that have test anxiety, a lot of people that are just general anxiety. My whole family is anxiety. I understand anxiety, depression. I get those feelings. And the biggest thing with test anxiety and testing is you got to just slow down and just take it one at a time. And you can only prep as much as you possibly can. I do not recommend staying up late. No point. I don't stay up till midnight. It's not going to help you. Go to bed at a reasonable time, get up at a reasonable time. By the time you get to a point, and no, I would never study more than about an hour at a time, maybe an hour and a half. By about 50 minutes, most research says that you're not retaining much after that. So breaks are often, you got to get in where you can. I get that, but those are my recommendations. We had kind of a scuffed stuff with the snow. I like to try and do my PowerPoint presentation on testing and study tips, but I'm going to kind of have to add that in later. But those are my big things. Sleep well before an exam, eat before an exam, because you need to eat in the morning. If you're not a person that eats breakfast, get a protein bar or something. You need to do something because you got to think you slept all night, you haven't eaten. If you just run on coffee, that's not nutrition. And I love coffee. Don't get me wrong, but that's not nutrition. Your body needs something to process. Otherwise, your brain is not going to be firing at full capacity. If you have no carbohydrates, no proteins, no fats for your body to work on, digest, and utilize, your body will not be effectively working. So eating before a test is good too. Also, I don't want anyone passing out, during my test. I'm just kidding. That's never happened. I hope that doesn't happen anytime soon. But those are some big tips to think about. And you're telling us this now on the precipice, of our test tomorrow, but you got 10 tests. A lot of people do really well on all the daily grades. So a lot of people's daily grade average pulls them up. It's worth 20%. The tests are worth 60, but there's 10 of them. So even if you do poorly on this first test or you have a poor test, you have a great ability to go swing yourself up and down based on the test. But like I said, after this test, by the second test, if you haven't met that 80% mark, which to me that is failing because this is how nursing works. Nursing school works this way. It's either you make the passing grade. It's like a bullseye. It's you either hit the bullseye or you don't. It's unfortunately either hit the bullseye or you're off the map. You're off the target completely. There is no in between. There's no grading curves. There's nothing like that. But if you don't make that mark, it doesn't even matter if you're way off of it. We need to go back and see how you're studying. Again, synonymously, I can relate most of the time poor test scores with bad study habits, working too much, or not being present in class. Those three things will kick you, they'll hurt you is what I mean to say. So again, with these classes and going into the program, working full time is definitely possible. Of course it is. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Doing school and working full time is terribly hard. I know that, trust me. I've worked 2 jobs the whole time. I pretty much did my bachelor's. I've worked the whole time I've been doing my master's, and raising twin girls, it sucks. It's hard. And for those of you that are doing it like as a single parent and stuff, my heart goes out to you. I couldn't imagine it. So it's tough, but come to me early. That's my point. Don't wait. Don't come to me at test 5 and you haven't met that 80% mark on any exam yet. Don't wait till exam 5. Come at me exam 2, 3. Come at me every time. We can make a meeting. We can look at your exam together. We can talk through what your thought process was on each question, that sort of stuff. Because a lot of what I'm trying to get to you guys is like finding the root of a question. You really want to find out what is the question asking me, and then my next step most of the time is, okay, what answer choices can I eliminate based on what I know? If the question is asking me about the thoracic body cavity, then I can eliminate things that are talking about abdominal cavity, talking about connective tissue, talking about cellular transport. I mean, that's a dumb example, but you can kind of go through the list and get rid of some questions so that if you get stuck on a question, you can at least eliminate some options and give yourself a decent shot. And I will say that a lot of times you need to go with your gut with taking tests. To me, there's some research out there, but it's just me personal. This is anecdotal, meaning that I don't have research to back it up directly. But to me, my experience, usually that first gut instinct, most of the time is right. That doesn't mean go fast and just pick your gut every time. That means that when you read a question and you read some answers, your brain and your eyes will kind of go to an answer choice, right? And hang on to that. Make sure you understand what the questions ask you, and make sure you read the answers all. And then after that, you start second guessing yourself. Stick with your first gut instinct and go there. I'd rather be wrong on a gut instinct than be wrong because you flipped an answer. You changed it after the fact. That hurts worse. That's like digging the knife in where the first one's like just a cut. You're like, well, that is what it is. Other strategies for test taking. Just someone have a question. Sorry. Someone unmuted for
Yes,
Elaine.
sir.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, sir. So I'm looking at the textbook, sir, and the objectives that are at the beginning of each chapter and the questions at the back. What role do they play in the exam when you're giving the exam? Are they useful information? What would you say to us in regards to those? Because I am thinking that the questions at the end of each chapter versus the objective, it's saying that you should learn these. So when I look at those 15 objective outline at the front and then the questions at the back, are they just there for their sake, or do they play a role when you're giving exam?
That's a good question. Like, I mean, it's 50-50 in a way. I mean, generally it just depends. My goal has always been to, again, the writers of this book are trying to get it all in, which is hard. I want to get as much in as I can. So my goal too with that is I look at their objectives and I do look at their questions and kind of see it's about 50-50. And I say that it just depends. That's why I focus a lot on highlighting specific things in class during lecture so that you can hone in on that, because some of those questions don't apply to us, at least as far as what we learned. Like, we didn't talk about skin cancer at all. I don't know if there's a question, but yeah. Or we didn't really talk about hair, but the same thing, like number 10 in the back of one of the questions, number 10 for chapter 6 was, how does hair growth occur? Well, obviously I said we're not touching on hair or hair follicles or hair growth. So that question is irrelevant, right? You wouldn't need to do that question for my exam. So it just depends, but some of them would apply. Like for like example, what is the number 1 on that same section says what's the name of the outermost layer of skin? And it has dermis, epidermis, hypodermis, and papillae, which is nothing to do with that, but something like that would be more what I'm in line with. So with those, it's gonna be up to you to kind of combine lecture and that together and see how those all apply. Again, the idea for the publisher and the writers of this book is they're trying to pick outcomes, and they're picking questions that test your knowledge of those outcomes. Every time you read some kind of section like that, that's what they do. That's what they're trying to do, and they are helpful. But like I said, 50-50. I can't focus on everything that they try to get, because again, there's 20 something chapters in the book, 10 questions each. We're looking at 250 questions that they've compiled to pull out of the information, and some of these I just don't think are relevant. So it just depends on you putting together what we talked about in class and what I highlighted and what the publishers of the book have highlighted. But they are good for practicing just question taking in general. Like I said, I recommend reading the entire chapter, so they're good to see if you retain anything from the chapter.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. Okay. So that's my big prep for the exam tomorrow. So like I said, we'll do more formal review in the morning before the exam. Well, it actually won't be more formal. It'll be more of a game. So your afternoon cohort can tell you about that. My games are a little bit off the cuff, but I think it's more fun that way. But it will be an ability to kind of refresh this. Yes. Was that Elaine, or who was that? Sorry, I didn't hear. Somebody was talking.
Yeah, no, I asked if we get there at 7 tomorrow.
Yes, everything's normal scheduled tomorrow. Should be at 7. It's been warm enough. Not all the snow's melted, obviously. Some back roads still have some melted snow on them, but as long as you guys don't drive like demons, you should be okay, I would say, most part. I haven't been on every road, but I've been out about today. So just take it easy. Same thing when it rains, you slow down, but you shouldn't stop. So somewhere in the middle of that, if you go 90 on the interstate when it's dry, maybe you should go 70. I'm just kidding. You should probably go like 50 when it's raining really hard, but I digress. I'm not gonna tell you how to drive. I'm not gonna say any names, but I've seen students, none of you necessarily, but I've pulled out of the parking lot with some students before, and I thought, I'm glad. I wish I wasn't on the road with them. I'll just say that. So if you drive like that, you should rethink your. You just drive like a granny. Just go the speed limit, chill. Because guess what? I've driven like that before when I was younger. I could drive like that now. We're all gonna end up the same stoplight. I promise you. We're not gonna beat. So just take it easy. 7 o'clock tomorrow for class. Like I said, we won't do the test first thing. So I do want to start the new content a little bit. Like I said, your cohort in the afternoon got to start it. We didn't get that far, but I do want to start it. So let's see if sharing my screen works. I guess we'll find out. That would be this. No. Oh boy. And I'm gonna do this maybe. Okay. Just making sure I got a bunch of phone notifications. I'm making sure that nobody's found my cell phone number somewhere and is trying to call me. There are some students that have my cell phone number, especially in the program and stuff too. So I don't give that out willingly, but if you end up with it, you could always text me sometime. I will reply depending on what it is. But if it's very school specific, I'll ask you to email me so there's a record of our conversation. But so if you do get my cell from somebody, I might answer a call, but we're not going to text each other. That's all I'm going to say about that. Like, I don't generally text with students. I want anyone to get the wrong idea. And it's just not a formal communication method. So I don't recommend it. But where we're going is chapter 7. So when we're done with that test tomorrow, we're moving on to unit 2. Unit 2 is 7, 8, 9, and 10. And it's all about skeletal system, bones, joints, and muscles. Chapter 10 is probably the hardest one because it's your first introduction into kind of the cellular level of muscles, where how do muscle contractions work, that whole process. And I try to kind of dumb it down in a way. Not that I'm so smart, I understand it, but I think it's very complicated. And so I've spent some time trying to dumb that down so it's easier to understand, even for me, really. So like I said, I don't ever claim to be the guy that knows everything. I'm still a bachelor's prepared nurse. I'm a nurse at heart. Nurses don't have to be the smartest people in the room. They just have to be some of the most compassionate. But you do have to have some intelligence to be a nurse, because you got to be able to think critically and think on your feet. So like I said, I've known plenty of nurses that were not that book smart, that were the best nurse I ever worked with. And I've known plenty of nurses that were probably some of the most book smart people I've ever met, but I wouldn't let them take care of me with a 10-foot pole. So it just goes both ways. So wherever you fall on the end of the spectrum, I think you want to make a good middle ground. That's what I think makes a good nurse. Somewhere in between those two polar opposites is a great nurse. So chapter 7 begins on page 102 in your book. I think 103. Yeah. 103, 101. I've got the Woo Clap pulled up. Hopefully you can see it. Like I said, there might be some questions for us to get to, but you don't have to stress about doing them. I'm just trying to pull it up like traditional, like we normally would in class. So chapter 7 is bone and bone tissue. So this gets into the cellular level of bone.
I'm sorry. Can you
Yes.
please go back to the recap really quickly?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. So the first thing that the book talks about, and I love some of their little fun fast facts. You'll learn that I like to highlight the fast facts. Some of them are just useless and interesting, like the first one on that page. And then I will always try in my lecture, if it's something that I think you should know or you might see on exam, as far as those little sections about the fast facts, or like the sections again that are life lessons. I think they're all in purple. I'll try to I will try and highlight those that are like these are should knows. Some of them are just interesting. And I think it's fun about this book. Like the fast fact on that first page says that bone is strong as steel and as light as aluminum. So like aluminum can that you drink a Coke out of, like I'm drinking here with a Dr. Pepper. Which, by the way, if you're a fan of Dr. Pepper, I mean, you should talk because this is the best thing that's ever been made, in my opinion. Anyway, yay! James got Dr. Pepper. That's my go-to soda. That's my indulgence. I try not to drink soda, but Dr. Pepper's too good. So I break down and buy one every once in a while. All right, so they're as light as aluminum can, but it can be as strong as concrete or steel. So bones are very interesting. That makes their cellular structure really weird. So the first page talks about kind of what bone's job is. What does it do? So bone's main functions, we've already talked about in chapter 1. We talked about all the 11 systems. So we talked about, protection, support, movement. Like, again, our body needs a lot of systems together because it takes muscles to move, but without the bones, we wouldn't move. Our bones act like hinges, right? If you kind of move your elbow, it's like a door hinge. Excuse me. It's the same kind of concept. If our bones weren't the shape they were and the position they were, we wouldn't be able to move. And that's why, certain animals, like that's why, the way of the leg bones of a cheetah are, right, allow it to move really fast. We can't do that because the way our bones are made. It's just kind of how it all works. So those are, I feel like shape and protection, movement, those are pretty obvious. The unique ones again that I've kind of highlighted before is definitely the big one is that blood production. That bones, um, our bones are places that house bone marrow, and without bone marrow, we don't make new blood cells, especially as an adult. Now, like I said, generally, all cells stem from bone marrow, especially when we're like a newborn infant to early, babies to toddlers. But as we get older, and then finally through puberty, our bones tend to stay pretty strong, but they're not as big about blood production. Everything slows down the older we get, especially after puberty. But bone marrow is important for blood cell production throughout life, even in well past into adulthood. So that's the key interesting point from the functions of bone. Electrolyte balance. Most of us think of electrolytes like potassium, but it kind of includes all of those guys: potassium, sodium, calcium, phosphorus. Calcium and phosphorus is what our bones are made of. Our bones are a high percentage of calcium, and most of you know that, right? Because you've kind of all heard growing up, right? If you break a bone, someone's like, you should drink more milk or something like that, right? Because milk has a lot of calcium in it. There's a lot of other ways to get calcium. I know there's a lot of people that aren't fans of milk. I don't know why. I like milk. I still have a glass of milk with Oreos. That's like the best treat, I think. But you can get calcium from many other ways, but it is important because that's what our bones are mostly made out of, is calcium and this exchange of phosphorus. So that's where the electrolyte balance comes into play with bones, is talking about mainly those electrolytes. But we'll get into electrolyte balance and the other big function, acid-base balance. Those go hand in hand. And again, my little synopsis of acid-base, that's not till the last unit, and I just don't have time to cover it as much as I'd like because it is complicated. But what that basically says is that our body has a certain pH, is what it's called, basically a balance. So if you imagine something's really acidic, like stomach acid, or the acid in like some cartoon you've watched somewhere that like melts something or eats away metal, that kind of acid, right? Very acidic, and like, tomatoes and other stuff fall low on that scale. A higher number means it's more base or alkaline, meaning like from bleach products to trying to think, distilled water, bleach, things that are different on the pH scale. We fall kind of in the middle, high end, more alkaline. And so that's all it's talking about, is that our bones do play a role in that. I think the biggest thing, though, that I can guarantee I'll ask you about is that blood cell production. You got to remember, bones equals bone marrow equals blood cell production. So the next slide and the next page in the book is 102, and it talks about classification of bones. And really what this is getting to is mainly 4 categories that bones can all fit in. And this is really just classification based on their shape. I will ask you some stuff about this for sure, but the examples the book gives us are pretty good, and we can look at these for sure. But flat bones is there at the top at the skull, which is really interesting. So flat bones, and you're thinking, well, my skull's not flat. I was joking with the afternoon group. I said mine is a little bit because I hit my head a lot when I was a kid. So I think there's some permanent damage probably. It's probably why I became a nurse. It's a joke. Don't listen. You got to be a little bit weird and a little bit interesting of a person, I think, to be a nurse. Okay, this takes it takes a different kind of personality. So nurses are not normal. That's what I say, and it's a positive, not a bad thing. Who wants to be normal anyway? What is it normal? So flat bones are skull. What flat bones are mainly saying is, and some of the bones that are in our face are flat technically too. This is again classified by shape. Flat meaning if you look at our skull, it's pretty smooth and thin, and it's like kind of a few pieces fused together. It's not right. We don't have jagged edges. We don't have horns. We don't have a bunch of ridges in our skull. It's very smooth and flat. That's where they get the flat bone discussion for our skull bones. Technically, some of the other ones is our ribs and our breastbone, which I already said is called the sternum, and we'll learn about that. But right, your breastbone you can feel is pretty flat. It's not too bumpy. That kind of smooth flat. That's your flat bones. Long bones, if you look, is the traditional bone, right? Most of us think of long bones like traditionally the bone that you get a bone for your dog. It looks like a long bone, and the long bones, as far as where they are pretty common ones that you've seen before. The femur in our leg, one of the biggest bones we have, right, in our thigh. What's called our humerus in the arm here, that's a long bone. We have 2 bones in the lower arm. The radius and the ulna, those are long bones. Like, so anything that's elongated, thinner, got kind of the 2 big heads at the end that attach. Usually all the long bones are going to be like mostly our extremities. So they play a key role we're going to look at in a second, but that's the traditional, like when you draw a bone, like when you're making a skeleton for some goofy, kids Halloween thing, you think of long bones, right? Short bones would be they're basically bones that are more like rectangles, more broad than they are long. And so a lot of long bones you mainly are going to find in your wrist and your ankle. And we're going to learn a lot about that here soon. But your wrist and your ankle mainly is talking about what's called our carpal for the wrist and tarsal for the ankle. But we're going to get into that, so don't stress too much. But those are all, because that's not just one bone. You can kind of see on that picture. It's hard to see. They don't really zoom it in. But I forget the number. See, there's 206 bones in our body, and I can't even remember all of them. But the ankle bones is a series of short bones like meshed together, and that's why like an ankle fracture down there right at the ankle can be really stink, or you could chip a piece of bone, one of those pieces, and have a lot of issues too, and doesn't heal as great. So our wrists and our ankles are made up of several small what they call the short bones, like small kind of rectangular shaped bones. And then we have irregular bones, which are pretty unique. Irregular bones pretty much is going to be in a couple places. And the book highlights them, and so is the slide. Irregular bones, mainly I just think of our spine. So irregular bones usually have they're not square, they're not smooth, they have unique shapes. And so what's called the vertebrae, the bones that make up our spine, are classified as irregular bones. They're usually bones that come in like various sizes and shapes, because even our spine, the vertebrae that's up here by our neck is slightly a little bit smaller, maybe slightly different shape than the vertebrae way down here at our lumbar, like our lower back, right? So those fall in the classification of irregular bones because of their shape. They are not always the same. And again, if I grab my 12th vertebrae here and I grabbed your 12th vertebrae and we looked at them, the general shape would be the same, but the little indications and little indentions and depressions would be slightly different, and that's what makes them the irregular. Those are the classifications of bones. That's what I wanted to think. We have some really tiny, tiny bones as well that are included. We're actually going to talk about those not until chapter, I think it's 12, the senses actually. We have 3 tiny, tiny little like 3 millimeter wide bones in our ear actually. And so we'll talk about those later. But interesting, they're called ossicles. And without those bones, actually, we wouldn't hear. So we'll talk through that when we get to that chapter. But interesting enough, I think. So, yes, what was I going to say? Yes. So, classifications of bones: flat bones, skull; long bones, you think extremities, the traditional like elongated bone you would draw if I told you to draw a bone. Short bones, mainly wrist, ankles, kind of short little rectangle bones; and irregular bones, main vertebrae. Some of our facial bones are irregular because their shape is elongated, that sort of thing. Page 103 talks about parts of the long bone. So this is where it gets in kind of the meat and potatoes of chapter 7, because chapter 7 spends a lot of time introducing a bunch of words you've probably never heard before and introducing us into like the cellular level of bone, like what actually makes bone, okay? But this is kind of where the conversation starts. Parts of a long bone are basically these little sections that they're specified specifically to long bones. And you say, why is it specific to long bones? Well, because they are the traditional bone. Also, without long bones, we would be limited in our bone marrow capacity as humans. We'd be limited in other things. So, like, again, long bones give us the ability to move and some of that big strength that we have. Without the long bones, we wouldn't have some of the strength and movement we have. And so we couldn't all just be made up of irregular bones. We couldn't all be flat bones. It wouldn't really work. So that's why they highlight long bones. And that's why we're going to have to kind of know the parts of these. So the picture is actually, I think if I'm looking at it correct, I think it's someone's left. Yeah, this should be somebody's left tibia. So the tibia and fibula are down below. And again, chapter 8 talks about we're going to learn all the names of the bones that, again, pulling out the ones I think are going to be relative to you as a nurse. I'm not going to make you memorize all 206 bones in the body. I had to do that. And you can see right now, I can barely name any of the wrists or ankle bones right now off the top of my head. So I don't expect you to do that. But we are going to highlight a few. So you don't have to know this is the tibia right now, but it's just giving us a picture of a tibia, which is an example of a long bone, to show us the parts. So each end of the long bone is called the epiphysis. If I was to say them together, I'd be talking about the epiphyses, each end. And here's some words from your test for tomorrow. This would be like your, for example, you could call that top part right there. So I'm pointing at my screen at home, but that top portion there of this bone, this epiphyses would be known as, technically would be known as the proximal epiphyses of this person's tibia, which is interesting because this is going towards the point of attachment. If you remember proximal and distal, right? Because the knee joint is right here. If you imagine this, I know you don't know bones that well, but this is basically the top. This is the bottom portion of your knee. This is where your knee joint is. So going up this way, this would be your proximal epiphysis. This would technically be the distal epiphysis. But the epiphysis or epiphyses is just the ends of a long bone. So you don't have to really know proximal and distal, but it does, to me, to look at that, go, okay, it makes sense a little bit more proximal and distal, closer to the point of attachment, farther away from the point of attachment. And then the middle shaft that basically where you would hold a bone, you could imagine, is the diaphysis, these physises here. Epiphysis, diaphysis. Diaphysis is the shaft, the whole interior portion there. The book highlights it, and I'm going to highlight it too, only because we talk about cartilage again. Cartilage is under the umbrella of one of our connective tissues, along with bone and blood. If you kind of remember that. I didn't touch on that with our little short review, but same thing. The book does highlight for us here this articular cartilage, and you don't necessarily need to know that right now. But it makes sense when we start putting chapters 7, 8, 9 together, especially with the joints. You see, most people you talk about, you've heard people having arthritis, right? Or osteoarthritis, bone arthritis. Arthritis usually is this cartilage that we have on either ends of our bones, especially these long bones where the big joints are, like our knee. That cartilage starts to wear out. That cartilage job is, you kind of remember, cartilage is dense, doesn't have a lot of blood supply, but it provides a kind of cushion layer. That cartilage job in this example on either end of our long bones is to provide like a smooth layer, right? Because if you do this right now with your knuckles and you kind of just do like this, that kind of hurts. It doesn't feel great. But if I put like a cushion in between and I did that, I don't have an example, but like a mouse pad, I can't really give you a great example of that. You can't even see it. No, never mind. I was going to try to yank my mouse pad up, but I have a desk mat. Anyway, same concept, right? It wouldn't hurt as bad. That's what cartilage is doing for us. So when people have arthritis, it's usually an inflammation that causes some wear and tear on those joints over years. Like I've seen, especially guys that are like in the military out of Fort Campbell that do a lot of jumping, like the 101st Airborne, do a lot of practice jumps out of airplanes. Even with a parachute, you still land pretty hard a lot of times on the ground. And those guys end up sometimes having, if they do a lot of jumps out of airplanes, they have to have their knees replaced like in their late 30s, early mid 30s, 40s, well before you think most people would have to have a knee replacement because their cartilage is just worn out. Their ligaments are worn out from constant impact. So cartilage plays a huge role in the health of our joints, and we're going to learn that. But the book's highlighting here is, hey, you should know that pretty much on the end of either every long bone we have, there's going to be some cartilage. And it makes sense because pretty much every long bone we have, each end ends at some kind of joint. In this scenario, the bottom of this, the distal end is the ankle. The proximal end at the top here, or the superior end, is the knee. So each side of the long bone ends at a joint, basically. So it needs good movement. The other big stuff, pretty much every part of this we're going to kind of have to know, unfortunately. There's not really stuff we can pull out. But if you kind of look back at the shaft again, the diaphysis, within that, you see there's this hollowed out area, right? This hollowed out area in the long bone is known as the medullary cavity or medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is just a hollow end. It's a cavity, and it's filled with something here. The book highlights it. It's filled with bone marrow. And again, key for bones, bone marrow is how we make blood cells as an adult, especially as a child, but definitely as an adult. So that's why long bones are so important. Their shape is designed that they hold a lot of our bone marrow in them. Our small flat bones in our skull or the short bones in our ankle and wrist, they have bone marrow, but not as much as these guys can hold, right? So that's what makes the medullary cavity important. You say, again, as we look into chapter 7, we're going to look into the structure of bone because it's still, even with this hollowed out end, it has so much rigidity. And again, this end is not filled with air. It's filled with bone marrow. It's just a cavity that's filled with bone marrow. A unique thing, I'll make the point now, this gets reiterated again later in this chapter, but you can see in this picture, if you're looking at it or you're looking on 103 in your book, this bone marrow is colored yellow, which is interesting. There's technically 2 types of bone marrow, and you will have to know this, but again, I said I will touch on it more. There's 2 types of bone marrow. There's yellow bone marrow, and there's red bone marrow. Now, there's another thing we've already learned about that is more yellow. Robert, did you have a question?
Hey, I'm at work right now. Are you still going to post this the recording online today?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Should be pretty easy peasy, I hope, to get it up not long after this. I'm just going to cut the ends off, put a fade on it, and upload it, so it shouldn't take a little bit.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, so 2 types of bone marrow, yellow and red. Yellow, there's something else we learned that's yellow. It's one of the connective tissues. It's fat, adipose. So a lot of what yellow bone marrow is, this picture would be a tibia of an adult. As adults, after puberty, we have generally more yellow bone marrow in this spot. Doesn't mean all of it is, but generally it looks yellow, and that's why they color yellow. Because yellow bone marrow is mostly fat. And it's mostly about what does fat do? Well, conserves body heat. But another thing it does, we learned about with connective tissue in chapter 5, is that it stores energy. So a lot of these are energy reserves, is what yellow bone marrow does. Now we have sections of bone we're going to look at that have red bone marrow, the other type. The other type of bone marrow, red, is generally the one that's kind of labeled as active. And it makes sense too, because I think of red bone marrow, I think of red blood cells or our blood. Remember, we talked about bone marrow is important for blood cell production. So red bone marrow is the one that's kind of thought of as more actively producing red blood cells. And in a child, like if you imagine an infant right now, they would have the same structure to their long bones, especially they would have the same structure to the shaft here, the diaphysis of their tibia, but it would be mostly red bone marrow and they're not yellow because they're still constantly producing blood cells. They're still constantly producing things like that.
Did you say they constantly the red bone marrow cells? I mean, bone marrow is actively producing red blood cells or just blood cells?
Just blood cells. That's a common misconception, is that because it's red, it only produces red blood cells. That's just a naming thing. It produces all blood cells because we have white blood cells that are also what we would talk about as our immune cells to defend us against viruses and bacteria and all that stuff, you know. So it just, that's why I say just produce blood cells. But if you ever get confused the difference between red and yellow, I make the point that red I associate with red blood cells because I know it makes blood, or I associate with blood because blood is red. Red bone marrow equals active, making blood cells. That's where I was trying to go with that connection. Yellow is more like dormant, storage of energy, that sort of thing. And again, we have red bone marrow as adult. It's just that these cavities are mostly going to be yellow bone marrow as adult versus opposite when we're smaller. So that's all housed in that medullary cavity. Just that's the name of the cavity. Again, not filled with air, filled with bone marrow.
So, Sarah, quick question. So if
Yes.
if an adult has a bone marrow transplant to do, where would they get that marrow from? The adult or from a child?
It depends. Sometimes they will get donations from adults, but they do donations from a child. I am not too familiar with the process, Elaine, so I don't want to speak on it too much as far as what they're going for. Generally, from my understanding, once the bone marrow is transplanted, once it's transplanted, a lot of times it kind of reinvigorates, because the thing is that this yellow bone marrow it's just mostly a combination of fat tissue. It still has all the properties of red bone marrow, so it can convert back. So my understanding in general is that after a transplantation of bone marrow, that bone marrow will become active again if it's needed, because normally you don't do a transplant of bone marrow unless it is needed. And in case of someone that has a blood cancer or something like that, like leukemia, or they use bone marrow transplants also to help treat sickle cell and other like hemophilia and other blood disorders. So that's my general understanding, but I don't want to speak on it too much. Hopefully that answers your question generally, but yeah, the thing is, if you imagine you were like, I don't know, imagine that you were bleeding profusely and you couldn't get to a hospital. If we weren't in the United States and there's a hospital in every corner. If you were bleeding profusely and you needed to make more blood cells, your body could convert this yellow bone marrow back to red bone marrow to help emergently produce red blood cells, or produce blood cells in general. Now that would have to be under severe conditions, severe loss of blood, that sort of stuff. But it is possible. Our body could flip it back and make a lot of this red bone marrow. So it is interchangeable. And then it's more of like a dormant. Imagine red bone marrow as the normal function of bone marrow. Imagine yellow bone marrow as like a dormant, hibernating, if that makes sense, bone marrow. It's mostly a lot of filled with fat tissue for energy storage, but it can become active if it needs to be as an adult still. So that's kind of the process why bone marrow transplants work. And that's a good question, Lane. I was kind of getting to that point too. The other two things that this highlights, like I said, we talked about the two ends is the epiphyses, diaphysis is the shaft, medullary cavity is the cavity in the middle that holds the bone marrow in a long bone. And then you have two little membranes around our bone. The membrane that lines the inside of this cavity is known as the endosteum. So remember, I talked about ENDO as like into or in something. So endosteum, you can see ENDOSTEUM, steum, like endosteum. So that's how I say it, but it doesn't really matter how you pronounce it. Endosteum is talking about inside, into, in something. Again, that's that same prefix that's come up before with endocytosis, our cell taking something in. So endosteum is it's just a membrane that lines the inside. It's just a thin epithelial membrane. Again, you can kind of remember we talked about cavities already with chapter 5, that a lot of cavities have some kind of membrane around them. Again, for friction reduction, for the ability to house cells so that molecules can get transferred around. It makes it easier. And once we look at the way cells are shaped on a cellular level, it makes a little bit more sense too. And then the outside one is called the periosteum. So again, another prefix word, but osteum is still there. I will make the point that pretty much that word osteo, so OSTEO, osteo something, you're going to be talking about something to do with bone, basically, almost always. So we're going to see OSTE and OSTEO, a lot of words. But we have a lot of things that are osteo something. Osteomyelitis is infection of the bone. We're going to talk about that. Don't stress. But I'm just saying that osteo word comes up a lot. The names of the cells that produce new bone and destroy old bone are osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteocytes are bone cells. You see how oste something comes up a lot, right? It's that synonymous thing where there is a Greek root word where there's a Greek root word where we can kind of relate all this. So if you see or read OSTEO, your brain should automatically go, we're talking about something about bone. I don't know what yet, but something about bone. Okay. So endosteum is that innermost membrane or inside the medullary cavity. Periosteum is the outermost that lines the whole kind of outside of a long bone. And again, I do want to reiterate that all these structures technically kind of they do exist on our other classes of bone, not just long bone, but they're in different proportions. That's why the book highlights long bones, or this is calling this the parts of a long bone, or the anatomy of a long bone, is that a long bone is like the epitome of a bone. It has all the components, where some of our short bones and flat bones might be limited on some of these components, but they still have them somewhat. Most of our short and long and flat bones just don't have the room for the medullary cavity, but they have a lot of the other components. So that's kind of what the difference is. The periosteum is interesting. We'll talk about periosteum again when we talk about joints, because that membrane on the outside actually does a unique thing. So remember I talked about we have tendons and ligaments, right? As one of our dense connective tissues. Well, the thing with tendons and ligaments is that their job is to either connect bone to bone or connect muscle to bone. And how does that connection work? Well, they're part of the connective tissue groups. And you have to remember that a lot of our connective tissue, the base of them, just depending on how they're structured, are going to have some kind of small protein fibers or molecular fibers. So if you imagine that my hand here is the membrane on the outside of the bone, when I have a tendon or ligament that needs to attach to it, now I can intertwine with the fibers of this membrane, the periosteum, with the fibers of my tendon or ligament, and now I have a connection point. Because we're going to look at bone cells next, but because the cells of bone, especially on the outside, to give it its structural rigidity, meaning it's how strong it is and rigid and firm it is on the outside. Because if you ever picked up a bone, right, like it feels hard, like it feels light, but it's really hard to give it that. It's hard to attach to it because they're also smooth. So that membrane on the outside of an active person helps give a connection point for the fibers of our connective tissue to attach. And so that we can attach tendons and ligaments where they're supposed to be. So that's really the periosteum's job. It's not really protecting the bone. The bone's pretty strong on its own. It's really just giving an attachment point for fibers of our connective tissue to intertwine with bone and keep it all in place. Um, yeah. So that's the thing too, is that the book's definition is that, yeah, going back to the medullary cavity and yellow and red bone marrow, I just had a thought. Just kind of remembering that the reason they distinguish that is, yes, red bone marrow, it looks more red because it's active in producing blood cells, and yellow bone marrow looks more yellow because it is mostly comprised, it's rich in fat, rich in adipose tissue, which is good for energy storage, and we need energy storage. But again, nothing in nursing and nothing in anatomy and biology in general, nothing is really in absolutes, right? Red bone marrow doesn't have no fat in it, right? You see what I'm saying? Fatty yellow bone marrow doesn't have any active producers. Does that make sense? Where there's no, it's all about variations, scales of things. There's not just like always a yes and a no. One has it, one doesn't. Not all the time. Sometimes, but generally there are some overlap, okay? In this case, there's overlap. Oh, that word's mentioned. So on 103, there's a fast fact at the bottom right in your book, and there's a body of at work section that's kind of purplish. Those two sections we're going to talk about because they are important. I don't have a slide directly for them, but they are somewhat important. So if you're looking at your book, it's on page 103. The fast fact talks about a condition called osteo. There's osteo. So we're talking about bone, and it's talking about myelitis. And I hope I mentioned this, but maybe I haven't, and I'll mention it now. Another keyword you can key in on that will tell you something forever in nursing. One is osteo is always going to tell you as a nurse, we're talking about bone something, right? The other one is the itis at the end of that. Osteomyelitis. I-T-I-S. Itis. You guys have heard of itises, right? Like laryngitis or this itis, whatever, okay? Itis is just a word that we use to indicate what's called inflammation. So like redness, cells, swelling, some kind of active process happening, or you're using it to indicate infection. And those two kind of have an overlap. They can go kind of hand in hand. You can have inflammation, irritation, redness, cells with extra blood flow without infection. But infection usually and inflammation are going to go hand in hand sometimes. You can have infection and likely you're going to have inflammation, but you can have inflammation without infection. The point is that put those words together. Now I've already talked about osteo is osteo is always talking about bone. Itis is always talking about either inflammation or it's talking about infection. So break that word down now, right? We said osteomyelitis. So bone something infection, right? I know that I'm talking about bone, and now I'm either talking about an infection or some kind of inflammation. I know that. Just because I knew that osteo is always bone, and just because I knew that itis is always some kind of inflammation or infection. Does that make sense? Like how you put that together? So the book highlights osteomyelitis as inflammation of bone and marrow. It usually is a result of bacterial infections. The most common thing I've ever seen osteomyelitis with is usually someone that has a foot wound that progresses and the infection makes its way into bone. And then that's a problem because it's really hard to treat. Why do you think it might be really hard to treat a bone infection? Well, if bone marrow is a producer of blood cells, right? That means that it has to have good blood flow. There has to be a lot of blood vessels that go into our bone. Otherwise, why would we have a component of our body that makes blood cells that doesn't have good access to blood supply? So if I have an infection that has made it to bone marrow, and bone marrow has a great amount of blood supply, you see how this kind of like series of events happens? People that get osteomyelitis are at a huge risk for that bacteria, whatever that infection is, of getting into their bloodstream and now spreading around the whole body because way I talk about blood and the whole system is it's like a huge highway. Blood goes everywhere. Blood touches almost everything in our body. There's not a place our body doesn't touch or blood doesn't touch in our body. So in bacteria roaming around our bloodstream equals bad news. That's what you end up with calling what's called bacteremia, bacteria, or septicemia, some kind of infection in the blood, but that doesn't matter. What is happening there, that's bad news because now I have a bacterium, I have a virus, I have something that can make it anywhere in my body, and that's a problem. So that's why osteomyelitis is dangerous. So you hear osteomyelitis, you think itis, inflammation, something's inflamed, osteobone, bone inflamed. And it's usually bad news. And osteomyelitis is a common problem if Usually it's for people that have wounds down their feet or somewhere, wounds that go untreated. And that usually happens with patients that have multiple conditions like diabetes. Because with diabetes, a lot of times people get neuropathy and they lose a lot of nerve endings and they have the inability to feel very well in their feet. So if you step on a nail, okay, I mean, I've seen people with diabetic neuropathy so bad to the point that they probably could have stepped on a nail and never known it. I haven't seen that exact scenario play out in practice, but I could guarantee it's probably happened. They wouldn't know it, and that wound just sits there, and they don't clean it, they don't do anything with it. And what if they are very, what if they don't have the most healthy lifestyle? What if they live in a very, dirty place? Well, that's gonna be an infection really quick, and now that infection, because they don't feel it, rages for 3 days, and then finally, when they get a fever and they notice their foot's falling off, right? They come to the doctor. At that point, their bones are infected. Now we're scared. So osteomyelitis is a scary word, but you want to know what it is. Again, like I said, all that spiel just to tell you to keep helping you think about when you see prefixes or suffixes like osteo and itis, you can start putting stuff together. They're just difficult to treat. And they usually osteomyelitis is usually an infection that's going to require the intravenous antibiotics because we're trying to stop it from getting bacteria or other pathogens in their blood and cruising around. We don't want it to have a free ride to go where it wants to go. The other thing on that same page is the body of work. It talks about what's called the I always have epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal plate. I always have trouble with saying that one. Try to say that 5 times fast. You should do it actually, because I don't know who's sitting around you guys right now. They'd be like, what are they saying? Epiphyseal plate is something you guys have heard of before. It's called the growth plate. Pretty much all bones, especially long bones, is why they're highlighting here, have some kind of epiphyseal plate, also known as the growth plate. So what this is, and you can see it in the book on this example they give of parts of the long bone. They don't highlight it here, but you see there's like all these little this looks like a sponge on this end, but there's this white line that runs through it. And that's what they're also showing on the head of a femur there in the body of work picture. The growth plate is basically this layer of cartilage that's not their traditional. It's not really, mostly it's cartilage and not bone cells. Why? This is how we grow, right? This is how the kid, right, that was in like 8th grade, okay, or 7th grade, and then he hits puberty, and then like 9th grade, he's 6'5" when he was like 5'8" or something, whatever it is. But that's how we grow. Basically, our growth plate, or what's the technical term, epiphyseal plate, allows us to just spread out. That layer of cartilage allows the bone cells around it to kind of add more bone on either side of that line to kind of make our bone bigger and bigger. So there's the line. On either side of it, our bone cells can produce, make our bones longer. That's how we grow. That's how we get taller or longer or whatever. After puberty, that process starts to slow down. And at a certain point in adulthood, that growth plate will be what they call closed. So basically, once puberty happens somewhere in adulthood, up until like usually anywhere from 21 to 25, we're still growing, even sometimes later, even, how far after puberty and that sort of thing, and hormones and what we eat. But some point at that plate is basically replaced. Not so much, that plate is replaced with compact bone instead of cartilage. And we're going to talk about compact bone. But that plate, instead of being cartilage and allowing it to have that kind of flexibility for the cells around it to stack on top of each other, it becomes just regular bone and not cartilage anymore. And once it's done that, it's the growth plate is closed, so to speak. And so that's what they're talking about with epiphyseal plates. They're growth plates. And like I said, it's highlighting, the book shows the one in the tibia, and there's a couple everywhere, usually at the end of long bones, so they grow longer and bigger. And that's just interesting. So if you hear growth plate, that's what they're talking about. And you hear someone say, oh, your kid's growth plate is closed, they're saying they're likely not growing anymore. They're likely not going to grow much more, is what it's saying. So that's part of the normal kind of after puberty aging process. That book highlights it again, so I'll bring it up again. But if you hear me ever mention growth plate, we're talking about that plate. So again, it's a lines on either end, either epiphyses of long bones that are mostly cartilage, and that cartilage gives it the ability of the bone to kind of grow around it. But after puberty, that cartilage now becomes what's called compact bone. It becomes solid bone, and now there's no room for bone to grow anymore, and it's done growing. I hope that somewhat makes sense. Maybe. I don't know. I might be just spitting silliness over here. We'll see. What's this? So I always like using my videos sometimes. I hope that you can see them. If you guys can't hear this, hold on. Stand by. Actually, you may not. Let me adjust the setting. Interesting. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. I raised my hand. I didn't mean to raise my hand. Like I said, unfortunately, I feel like that Teams is not that intuitive to me. But like I said, I may be a curmudgeon or whatever they call me, a grumpy old person right now. I guess I'm a boomer. Is that the joke? I don't know.
Hey, when people think of bone, a lot of times we can think of just a solid white structure that's just uniform through.
Can we hear that or no?
No holes in it, no cavities,
Yes,
none of that sort of
some
stuff.
people.
But in reality, bone is living tissue. It's got different types
We
of
can hear
marrow.
it.
It's got
Okay,
arteries and
thank you.
veins. It's got all kinds of stuff that living tissue has. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the anatomy of a long bone, see what all it's made of, and see what each part does. Let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So let's start off with an outline of a bone. And this is going to be a long bone. In particular, we're looking at an outline of the femur. But all the parts that we go through exist in any of the long bones in our body, such as the humerus or radius or ulna. And a lot of this exists in other bones like the skull and the pelvis and all of that, just not the exact same layout as the long bone here. Now there's three main regions of the bone. The middle, or the main part of the shaft of the bone, is called the diaphysis. And on either side of the diaphysis, we have something called an epiphysis. The epiphyses are on either end, and the diaphysis is the long shaft of the bone. Now we have a name for each epiphysis depending on which side of the bone it's on. So the part of the bone that's closest to either the shoulders or the hips, or the point of attachment, we call the proximal epiphysis. And in the case of the femur here, this proximal epiphysis will form a joint with your pelvis to make your hip joint. And the part of the bone that's the farthest from that point of attachment is the distal epiphysis.
So again, he's making that point, right? Distal and proximal epiphysis. I'm not too concerned about that, but it does help you kind of put those terms again in perspective. Again, because he's showing a femur, that epiphyses right there is the head of the femur where it makes the hip joint. So that makes sense. That's the proximal end of that long bone, closest to the point of attachment. The distal epiphysis is farthest away in this bone comparison than epiphysis. So it's a nice point to make. I'm not going to like ask you a test question that's like specifically proximal distal epiphyses of a bone. At this unit and this chapter, we're trying to focus on just terms and new words. So
in the case of the femur here, this would be connecting with your knee. Your kneecap or patella bone would be right in there, and then your tibia and fibula would be distal to that. So we have the diaphysis, which is the long shaft of the bone, and then we have the two ends, which are the proximal epiphysis, closest to the point of attachment, and the distal epiphysis, farthest from the point of attachment. Now on either end of the bone, we have something called the articular cartilage. And the articular cartilage is going to be a layer of cartilage that covers the end of the bone where it forms a joint with another bone. Our bones are very rough. And so if we had bones rubbing against each other, that would cause a lot of friction. That would cause osteoarthritis. That's what happens whenever this cartilage breaks down and the bones are rubbing against each other. So the whole purpose of the articular cartilage here is to form a smooth, low friction area so that whenever we move our joints, it doesn't rub our bones together and cause pain and damage to the bone. And so we see the articular cartilage here where it forms a joint with our hip. And we see the articular cartilage on the distal end where it forms a joint with our kneecap or patella and our tibia. Up next, we have red bone marrow. Now, if you look at this, it looks like spots all over here, but it's really more like a sponge. So think of the inside of our epiphyses as sort of the sponge-like area. Then all the holes of the sponge are filled with red bone marrow.
We can't hear you.
Thank you. So that's the point he's starting to make too right now, is where we're going to get into talking about compact bone versus what's called spongy bone, basically. But he's kind of laying it all out there. So basically, right, the that shaft, the diaphysis with the medullary cavity, is full of usually yellow bone marrow. But you can see here that, like I said, we still have plenty of active red bone marrow as adults. We just don't need as much as we did as a kid. So what he's highlighting here is that you can imagine at the end of each of our long bone, at the epiphyses, that we've got these layers of what's called spongy bone. This layer, again, it looks very porous and like a sponge. That's why they call it that. That red bone marrow is usually settled there, and that's where it stays. So it stays active. So we have sections of active red bone marrow throughout our body through our entire life. We just don't have as much. Our body goes from like grow to stop growing, so we don't need as much energy and red blood cell production blood cell production as we did. We just need more energy reserves because we're getting old and we need energy. So he's labeling this all out. I would just suggest let him label it all out because he does a good job of drawing it at the same time. And then again, we're about to get into the difference between spongy bone and compact bone. But both of those bone types are just types, the way the cells of the bone are structured, and they help us understand like how the bone looks, that sort of stuff.
Now, when people think of bones, they usually think of structure and protection, like our skull protecting our brain and stuff like that. But our bones are also in charge of making all of our blood cells, all of your red blood cells, which carry oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body, and all of your white blood cells, which help fight off pathogens and bacteria and viruses and things like that, are all made in the red bone marrow in your bones. In a long bone, we find this red bone marrow in either epiphysis, but we also find bone marrow in our skull and our sternum and our pelvis and lots of other bones as well. So our red bone marrow makes all of our blood cells. Now, if you notice here where I've got the red bone marrow drawn, there are these areas where there isn't any red bone marrow. For example, right here between those sections, or right here we have one, and then finally we have one down in here. And those are called epiphyseal plates. Epiphyseal plates are the location where your bone will grow as it grows longer. So when you were a kid and your bones were growing longer as you get taller and stuff, these are the areas where your bone cells were producing more calcium deposits in order for your bones to grow longer. They're not just growing longer throughout, they're going longer on these ends along these epiphyseal plates. Now, once you reach the point where you're...
Panthea, did you have a question? Did you raise your hand on accident? It happens. I don't know. But anyway, what he's saying too is that, again, epiphyseal plates, growth plates, start off as cartilage, and that gives the ability. What you have to think about with bone is that it is so strong because it's like, that's the thing. It's the same kind of concept. Like if you've ever seen a tree stump, right? Like a tree stump looks like concentric rings, and it's like, it looks very solid. Our bone is somewhat the same thing, very solid. So it has to be designed in a way. It's not like our skin where the cells are kind of can move around a little bit and take some depression or bouncy or spongy. Bone is not spongy in a sense. From the outside, it all feels hard. And so it has very limited specific ways that molecules can move in and out of cells. And that's why it's designed this way, is so that's why we have a growth plate, because that cartilage is spongy and allows movement of molecules. It allows the bone cells to keep producing more calcium and produce stuff to make more bone cells so it can grow. And when it hardens, it's done. There's no movement that can happen anymore. Bone is designed with blood vessels all throughout it, so stuff can move that way. But as far as the bone cells themselves, a lot of, especially compact bone, they're like concrete. They're solid. They have to have channels for things to move into them. And we're going to look at that. But that's what he's talking about, is that blood flow and the way the growth plate works, is that's why it works that way.
You're not growing any taller, these epiphyseal plates will kind of start to fade and form what we call an epiphyseal line. And doctors can actually look at x-rays, and as that line or epiphyseal plate starts to fade, that's when they know that, okay, this person's not going to be growing anymore, because that epiphyseal plate is no longer depositing new bone material to help the bones grow longer. And so in the case of the femur, we've got a few of those, one right there, and then one down on this end. But depending on the bone, those epiphyseal plates will be arranged slightly differently. In addition to red bone marrow, we also have yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is going to run down the length of the bone, or the diaphysis, and it's going to fill what we call the medullary cavity. A cavity is just a hollow space inside of the body, and so this is a hollow space inside of the bone, but it's filled with this yellow bone material. Now, a common misconception is that red bone marrow makes red blood cells and yellow bone marrow makes white blood cells, which makes a lot of sense because we've got 2 colors of blood cells, 2 colors of bone marrow, but it's wrong. The yellow bone marrow doesn't make blood cells at all. Your white and your red blood cells are made in the red bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow has a different function, and that's going to be the storage of fat and nutrients to help the bones. So red bone marrow makes blood cells, yellow bone marrow, fat storage. Now, there's a couple exceptions to that. When you're first born, you actually only have red bone marrow. And by the time you reach the age of 7 or 8, about 50% of your red bone marrow has converted into yellow bone marrow to work as fat storage and not to produce more blood cells. But if you ever get really badly injured and you're suffering lots of blood loss and suddenly your body needs to make blood cells as fast as possible because you're losing blood, the yellow bone marrow can actually revert back to red bone marrow to increase the rate of production of blood cells to try to keep you alive. So red bone marrow makes blood cells, yellow bone marrow fat storage, but in times of emergency, it can convert to red in order to make blood cells. Now, there's 2 types of bone that we find in our long bone here. One is spongy bone, and I already talked about the red bone marrow sort of filling the area within the sponge. Well, we call this bone that's surrounding that red bone marrow spongy bone. The other type of bone is called compact bone, and the compact bone is going to fill anywhere in this diagram where it's just white space. So this is all compact bone in here, around here, along the epiphyseal plate is compact bone, and it's really important that we have both types of bone. So let's talk about the function of each.
So that's what we're going to do now. He does a good job. I'm going to come back to him. Maybe if I can get this thing to exit. There we go. So the next section of the book is like 104 and 105. It starts getting into more about the specifics of bone tissue and bone cells. Like, what are we looking at here? Is this a question? Yes.
Is this like the guy that you just had up? Is he a YouTuber? Like, is he on YouTube or something?
His YouTube channel is called Siebert Science. I don't know if he's actively making YouTube videos. He's a high school anatomy and physiology teacher or biology teacher.
Okay, say his name one more time.
It's
I like how he explained it.
Yeah, he does a great job. I use a lot of his videos. So it's let me just do. Sorry, guys. That's him right there.
Oh, wait. Let me go back to it. Hold on. Oh, Siebert Science. Thank you so much.
And yeah, it looks like he's still, I've been using the stuff that he posted like during COVID, but he's got some updated stuff here. Anatomy of the wrist. He's got lymphatic system, which I might need to look at that when we get to that chapter. That was posted a day ago. So yeah, he does a lot of stuff. Spinal cord regions. Yeah, so he's added some stuff too as well. He does a great job of explaining things, and he does his drawing. His animations are really great. I enjoy them. So it's just another way to learn. But Siebert Science, super nice guy. He seems. I say that like I met him. I don't know. I've been a YouTube person for a long time. That's mostly my media I consume. So usually I watch YouTubers for if I don't watch YouTube people if I think that morally or they seem like self-entitled. I don't get into that. So I like his attitude. But yeah, and he makes funny jokes that make me giggle. So, but that's Siebert Science. I use him a lot. He does a great job. And like I said, he does what I can't do. He can draw on the fly, or he's figured it out for sure. So which are the following are functions of bone? So this kind of question is kind of one of those. Choose all that apply. This is that select all that apply. This is that question type where it's possible that all of them could be right. That's usually not the case. I would say most of the time that's never the case. But it's always possible that 3 out of the 4 could be right. It's possible that 2 out of the 4 could be right, that sort of thing. When you do select all applies, it matters. You have to have all of them, right? You've got to have all the correct answers. Again, select all applies as they apply to nursing, or for us and for your NCLEX exam. When you ever see them, they are all or nothing, meaning you either get it all right or you get no points for it. So I can kind of see most people are on par here with electrolyte balance, blood production, acid-base balance. So those are the correct answers. So didn't mention anything about blood glucose. Again, don't always get mixed up with glucose is sugar. and it usually is corresponding with energy. And just because bone marrow stores energy and probably does store a decent amount of glucose, don't kind of read into it too much. Just go with the information you've been given so far. And so far in the book, those are the only 3 functions it listed. And so that's what we're kind of going with. So bone tissue is page 104. And so bone tissue is talking about, basically you can label bone tissue is also known as, this is a tough one, osseous tissue, as far as I know how to pronounce it. It's at the very top of page 104, but I don't really call it that. I'll probably just say bone or bone tissue. And remember, bone is actually under the category of connective tissue, technically, which makes sense. It connects us. But there's that OSS or OSEO stuff again, right? Like you could, now that you know OSTEO or OSSEO, like that Ozzy, like not Ozzy Osbourne, but Ossie OS is something bone. You can kind of see osseous tissue and think, I'm talking about something about bone. So and then in the fast fact there's too, the study of bone is osteology. I don't know any osteologists. I don't know that that's actually a thing, but pretty much you could just put any Greek prefix in front of ology and it's the study of something, right? So osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteocytes, okay? 3 variations. The funny thing is that technically, it's really interesting. Osteocytes, excuse me. So we know osteo is bone, right? We've already learned that the CYT site is going to be cell. So osteocyte is just, in English from Greek, would just be bone cell, okay? Osteocytes are the like top dog bone cells. They are the ones that do everything. The other ones are labeled specifically because our bone cells take a little while to mature, and as they mature, are immature. So imagine like your immature child, like your children are immature, right? They don't know how to make, they can't balance a checkbook. They can't, make financial decisions. They're immature. They're osteoblasts or osteoclasts. Osteoblasts or osteoclasts just do one of 2 jobs, and they're immature, but they're growing up. Once an osteoblast or osteoclast grows up, so to speak, it matures fully, it becomes an osteocyte. And an osteocyte can do both things. An osteocyte can do everything that either one of the 2 other categories could do before. And so osteoblasts, how I remember this, osteoblasts are helping build bone. So blast starts with a B, right? Okay. So osteoblasts are more about bone building or building bone, B, right? See how I'm kind of relating that? That makes sense, right? So osteoblasts are helping build bone up. So you can imagine, as I'm hitting puberty and I'm jumping from 5'8" to 6'5", I wish, but didn't happen for me. If I'm doing that, my osteoblasts are working harder. Does that make sense? They're building more bone. The other one is osteoclast, and the way the book defines it is dissolve unwanted bone, and that does happen, right? We may have excess bone if we had a fracture, or we need the minerals. Like, for example, our bone's made of calcium. What if you're really low on calcium? Well, our bone could break down some of our bone cells, break down some of our components, turn it into calcium we need so we don't like die, right? Okay. Osteoclasts do that. I think of clast as like declutter with a C. Osteoclasts like declutter our bones, get rid of old material that we don't need. These are still separate types of cells. They're just immature bone cells. They're immature, not fully mature osteocytes. Once they are fully mature, they now become an osteocyte, and an osteocyte can do either or. An osteocyte can do the building. An osteocyte can do the decluttering. It can do either one, depending on what's needed from the body. So some will do both, some will do either one, but osteoclasts and osteoblasts are just immature, I mean they're made and then they're doing their job, but they're like getting trained up, so to speak. Does that make sense? Like they're like the apprentice, and once they're the master, now they're an osteocyte. So that's the best way I can explain osteoclasts, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. Yes, someone have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. So do they so do it go from osteoblast to osteo? Do they eventually mature? Like, is these stages of maturing,
It's
or
not.
do they just have different?
Yeah, it's not stages. Do you imagine that a new bone cell is formed? It can either be an osteoblast or it can be an osteoclast, but it's not a full osteocyte yet. The osteocyte is like the matured bone cell that has been through puberty and now a working, functioning adult bone cell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, so it can be they're gonna come out and they're either gonna be a blast or they're gonna be a clast, but they can't be both. And then once they're not that anymore, now they're an osteocyte. They can do both those functions now.
Okay, I understand them. Thank you.
Okay, yes. But the way I remember blast is building up bone, like you're building a tower, build up bone. Class is declutter, get rid of stuff we don't need. And like I said, a lot of this has to do with maintaining blood levels because what our bones are made out of is predominantly calcium and predominantly what's known as phosphate. And those are technically electrolytes. Most of us know what calcium is, but again, osteocytes are kind of like the guy running the show, and they can do both things, but they also are the mature ones. So they tell the immature guys. So imagine again, like I said, if our blood levels, say, of like calcium was dropping, and our bones are made of calcium, right? That molecule. We don't have enough calcium in our blood. The osteocyte can go, yo, hey, osteoclasts, break down some bone so that it dumps calcium in our blood, and now calcium levels rise. You see what I'm saying? But what if we have too much calcium in our blood? If we have too much, the guy that's in charge, the osteocyte, can go, hey, osteoblast, I need you to grab some calcium, and now you can build more bone. And that gets rid of the calcium out of our blood, brings it back down to normal. So that's kind of what their role is. And that is a lot to do with acid base and electrolyte balances, which is kind of a part of the dual role along with the bone marrow and blood production of the cells. So sorry, I had a thought. I wanted to make sure I touched on it. The other thing that I would touch on there, so hopefully that makes sense as far as how to remember the word blast and clast and what again, basic though is osteocytes. They're like the leader, the mature one, they can do it all. If you look down that page, there's a section that talks about, there's a little pictogram kind of thing that talks about tensile strength, compression strength. You don't have to know that. What it's showing us though is that bone has its strength mainly in like stretching and its strength in like compression. So like if I have imagine I have an imaginary long bone in my hand, all it's saying is that I can push like this and there's no way I could break it. I can pull like this, I'm probably not going to break that bone. But if I twist the bone, then I can probably break it a lot easier. And that's usually what happens with falls. When you fall or break something, the impact is usually hard enough that the bone twists and then snaps a lot of times. That's where you like break an ankle. Like that's what happens. You like step in a hole, right? And you keep walking. It's not really that you stepped in a hole that broke your ankle, right? It's that you stepped in a hole and you kept walking, so it twisted the same time it pulled, and now you broke your ankle. That's all it's kind of showing. I don't care that you know that directly because I think that's not helpful necessarily, but it's giving you an idea of how strong bones are, where they're weak at. They're weak at twisting. That's all. But right underneath that, there's on that page 104, there's a body of work right there section that says whenever bone experiences an increased load, osteocytes stimulate the creation of new bone. So weight-bearing exercise basically stimulates osteocytes to tell osteoblasts and the osteocytes themselves to build up more bone, making bones thicker and stronger. So this is why this is a unique nursing thing. The reason I'm highlighting this is a very nursing thing, okay? Talk about patient interventions and things. This is why people that have the disease that we're going to learn about in these chapters, osteoporosis, porous bones, they have. Some of you have probably heard of osteopenia, osteoporosis, right? Some people, maybe. It doesn't. Okay, we'll get there. But when you have a disease of the bone, it means your bones are brittle or weakened, How do you do that? You actually do weight-bearing exercises because it stimulates osteocytes. And again, we're not talking about grandma that's, 90 pounds out there, bench pressing. Okay. It's not what we're talking about weightlifting necessarily. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. Light weights, like 5-pound dumbbells and doing exercises with that sort of stuff. That stimulates production of bone, which is a good thing for someone that has a bone disease that we're trying to treat. So the reason I make that point now is that's a very, very nursing specific thing. So it's something to keep up with. So you just think like lifting weights makes me hulky muscle, yes, but it actually increases my bone strength. And again, I'm not really talking about that you have to lift like giant weights. I'm just talking about weight bearing exercise. That could be walking. That can be, speed walking, that could be grandma at the mall speed walking. Do people still do that? I don't know. You know what I'm talking about? Like the fast walk. They probably do it around the neighborhood. I don't know. But malls aren't really a thing anymore, I guess. That's what they're talking about. I'm kind of running out of time, but I will touch on this. I've already mentioned this, so I want to get into it. This is page 105. So this is where we get into the more hardcore discussion, at least about the cellular structure of bone. And so I'm not going to get to all this tonight, obviously. I'm going to touch on it here. And this is where we'll spend probably 30 minutes plus just on this because there's a bunch of words that you're never going to have heard of in your life in this. But there's two types of bone tissue itself. Okay. There is what's called, what we're talking about, spongy bone. It's also known as cancellous bone is the other name for it. On an exam, I don't use cancellous bone because I don't know. I just don't use it. I try not to use double naming when I don't have to. The only time I use double naming on a test is if it's something that gets brought up a lot in articles I read and other A&P books I read. And so I don't see cancellous bone that much. Most every book refers to this as spongy bone. But that's the first picture in the very top of 105. That is spongy bone. This guy right here, this is spongy bone. And you can see that it's got a really weird shape to it, right? So spongy bone is all this section. It's almost like a lattice work or a web. It almost looks like pasta or something, right? Now, this is hard, but it's full of what these elongated like clumps of things with cavities in the middle, okay? They're called trabeculae. That's listed on the top of 105. Well, it's listed under spongy bone. Trabeculae is what you call this like lattice work, and it's listed here in this picture. But they call it spongy bone because of its shape. And it also, basically, it's unique. Spongy bone is found in a lot of and pretty much every bone. But like Siebert Science was showing us, spongy bone is mostly found in either end of a long bone, in the epiphyses area of a long bone, where most of the rest of it's kind of hard. Spongy bone does a couple things for us. The interesting thing is that it gives little cavities. Guess what's filled in these little cavities in spongy bone? Red bone marrow. That's where our red bone marrow likes to hang out. It's got a space to sit. The unique thing about this structure of all this lattice work known as trabeculae is that if you imagine, right, like, I don't know, it's hard. I don't have the best example in front of me, but if I have like one finger up and I start putting weight on it, like my finger's eventually just going to bend and fall over. But if I get like a mess of fingers, like same thing here, if I have my fingers straight like this, yes. But if I have like all my fingers in a angle and tied together, this is stronger than just straight up. Because if I do this straight up right now, like my fingers eventually bend and kind of fall over. But if I was like able to do some kind of collaboration of my fingers and do this, it's going to be tougher. Like it's about weight distribution, basically. It makes the spongy bone is what gives our bone the ability to be light, but also very strong. Because it has these cavities, it allows a space for red bone marrow, and it also, again, allows our bone to be light, but also have the ability to handle shock absorption, so to speak, and be able to handle tight compression. And that's what makes bone so unique. But that's what spongy bone's job is. This shape makes it light, it holds red bone marrow, and the character is all about like making bone light and tough at the same time. And again, that word is weird, but the word for this lattice work, and we're going to go over this again, but the word for all this like what the book calls lattice work, and I don't know how else to define it, because saying pasta makes it sound like it's soft. It's not soft, it's hard, but that's called trabeculi. And again, with these weird words, guys, you just gonna have to sound them out. Like bec, you lie. LAE in most anatomy is like lie or lay. It just depends. So it could be trabeculae or trabeculi. It just depends. Listen, however you say stuff is irrelevant. As long as you remember what it is, who cares how you say it, okay? For the longest time I read all the Harry Potter books, I did not pronounce Hermione's name correctly until I watched the movies after I'd read all the books, and I was like, oh. But I didn't know any better. Tam, did you have a question?
Yeah, you said it holds it also holds the red bone marrow.
Yes.
Okay, and one more question. Are you gonna after this, are you gonna go back to the definition? Because I forgot I didn't write the spongy definition down.
I mean, spongy bone is just one of the types of bone. It just has two types, spongy bone and compact bone. Spongy is found in every bone, but also in the epiphyses, the ends of long bone is where it's found a lot too. As far as, again, kind of going back to that long bone structure, like the anatomy of the long bone, again, you can see here on this picture of that tibia again, that when it cuts away here, again, this is like a sagittal section almost, or no, this is a frontal section of this. It's cut out frontally here to show us the medullary cavity, but you can see in here, this all looks like a sponge, right? It has like all these little holes in it. This is all spongy bone. Where the guys that are in this image are solid, like tan or solid white, would be what we're going to talk about kind of later and tomorrow, is compact bone. Bone that is built differently. It doesn't have that same lattice work structure. It's much more dense. So compact bone and spongy bone. So again, spongy is usually found at the ends of the long bone and the middle of some bones. Like, for example, those short bones, those little rectangle bones that make up like our ankle and stuff, they don't have a lot of room for much else besides like an outside layer of compact bone and a layer of spongy bone, but they don't have a medullary cavity really, right? They're not going to have that. So you can see even here in this picture, like you can see like the very outside of a bone is going to have this almost looks like circular tree-like, right? This is very dense and thick, right? That's compact bone. Spongy is this lattice work looking stuff that has what's called trabeculi. And trabeculi is just just a name for these little physical swirls that are in here. Again, they're solid, but they produce these small little cavities that holds the red bone marrow. And like I said, this is the picture of compact bone. So if you look at this as a cross section, this is like a little tiny piece of pie sliced out of the epiphyses of a long bone. Like I took a little slice and now I'm looking at compact bone and the spongy bone that's within it at the end of the epiphyses. And then this is like if I took an even smaller slice and just looked at that compact bone on the outside right here. That's like if I just took a slice and I'm just looking at this, just the compact bone. That's what it is. So I'll probably just leave it there because there's a bunch of words that you've never heard of in your life in compact bone, like lacunae and canaliculi, which sounds like some kind of Italian dish. Those things we'll have to talk through that a lot, and then we'll have a worksheet too that we'll do on this stuff, because I think the biggest thing that people struggle with, chapter 8, pretty easy for unit 2. Chapter 8 is just talking about what's the bones names and where do I find them. Most of us have heard the song, like, you know, the leg bones connected to, it's the same concept. We just kind of practice that. Most people struggle with this, the names and the terms and definitions to kind of describe spongy bone and compact bone. But think of compact bone as the name of the bone that's on the outside of the bone that gives it that toughness. And then on the ends of long bones are usually on the interior. So like superficial part of a bone is like compact bone on the outside. And then the deeper layer usually is filled with that spongy bone. It's that lattice work that gives holes for red bone marrow to sit. but also it's still very structurally sound because of that lattice work. It has cavities, but it's very sound. It gives it the ability to handle a lot of force still and be light. Because if our whole bone was all compact bone, it's so dense that we would weigh like a metric ton. We wouldn't be able to walk even. So that's why we're designed this way. So as far as like, again, we'll after the exam tomorrow, we'll pick up on 105 here. This is where we'll pick up and we'll dive into it again. And like I said, as far as like making a mental note of like what I really want to understand is that you're going to have to understand the difference between compact and spongy bone. Spongy bone should be fairly easy, but the way to tell the difference is like, how is it, like, what does it look like? What's its purpose? And where do I find it? That's kind of how those are the three questions I usually ask with anything in anatomy is like, what does it look like? How can I tell what it is? Where do I find it? And why does it exist the way? Why is our body designed that way? Why is it doing that? You know, and that would rule, those three questions would apply to anything in our body.